Hello, my name is Marianne Williams. I'm a specialist gastroenterology dietitian at Somerset Partnership NHS Foundation Trust. And we're running a series of episodes on how to run a webinar for your patients. We're getting a lot of requests for information on this, so we thought it might be simpler just to run a webinar and upload it to YouTube so that we can pass over some of the information we've learnt along the way. And I have to say, I wish we'd had some of this information when we started, because there's very little out there for people wanting to set up webinars specifically for patients. So this is the third episode in the series, and this is setting up your first webinar. And these are the points that we've learnt along the way. I'm sure it won't be every point that you need, but it'll be a good start and give you a good set of information that you can base your first webinar from. Before we go any further, I just want to introduce you to our webinar team. So we've got Kerry Marchant, and she is our IT webinar expert. You've got myself, Marianne Williams. You've got Leah Seamark, who's our outcomes guru, and you've got Leslie Harper, who's a very important member of the team as well. So let's look at where you start. Where do you start when you want to run a webinar for patients? Hopefully you'll have watched the other two episodes that we've done. The first episode is in why you would want to run a webinar for patients in the first place, and that gives quite a lot of our data that we've found, because we've been collecting data from them, and gives you some good pointers as to why patients find webinars extremely useful. Our second webinar in the series is what webinar company you should use. We use GoToWebinar, their pro version, but there are lots of other webinar companies out there. And that second webinar will just give you a few pointers as to when you're choosing a webinar company, what are the elements that you need to consider that that webinar company will offer you. So when we're going to start looking at a webinar, what first thing I think that's really important is that you ask your IT department to allocate you a dedicated webinar email address. Now, you may already have an email address that you use for your department, whether you're physios, OTs, speech therapists, dietitians, consultants, doesn't really matter. But what you don't want is to overburden that email address with registration emails. You want to try and keep it separate from your webinar registration. And there are other reasons for that as well, which you'll come across as we go through the presentation as to why a dedicated email address is really useful. Otherwise, you could find yourself pulling your hair out in frustration. So what I would say is, when you ask the IT department to allocate you an email address, ask them to keep it really simple. You want an email address that GPs can remember, patients can remember, that everybody can use really easily. You don't want long, convoluted email address. So we at the moment have got patient.webinars@nhs.net. And we've also got a separate one called gastro.webinars@nhs.net as well. Sort of says what it is on the tin, keeps it very simple for everybody to remember. So looking here at what we want to, who we want to aim the webinar at. And that sounds so basic, really simple, but actually I think it's really important you go into quite a lot of detail about this before you set your agenda for that email. So if I use our IBS patients as an example, IBS patients can have varying needs. Some of them want really detailed advice on something like the low FODMAP diet. Others, and a lot of them, just want very basic first-line IBS advice. They may have just been diagnosed and they want to know what they should be doing. There is so much information out there on Dr. Google that causes lots of confusion, and what they really want is specialist NHS advice from people who really know what they're talking about, that they can rely on that information as accurate. So what we decided to do with the IBS webinars is we've created one that is first-line advice for those that have just been diagnosed, and then one that's very specifically on the low FODMAP diet. So looking at who you want to aim the webinar at is very important. What I would really recommend you do is that you ask patients beforehand what they would like to achieve from a webinar. What are the questions that they really want to have the answers to? It's very easy for us to assume that we know what patients want to know, and actually it's much better to actually ask the patient and check that we're getting it correct. So we always send out a survey monkey to our patients beforehand, or to a cohort of patients, just to get some feedback, and that way we can really direct our presentation appropriately. So for instance, we did a celiac webinar recently, and we sent a survey monkey to the local celiac group, and they gave us feedback on what they would like us to cover in a webinar. Really, really useful. The next element that you're going to have to look at is whether you want to run the webinar live or on demand. Now, the difference here is that, for instance, for the first 7 or 8 months, we ran our webinars live. Every third Monday of the month at 7 o'clock, we would run our IBS webinar. So people would email us on that dedicated email address, and they'd ask the registration details, we'd send it, they'd register, they'd get automatic reminders from the webinar company, and then they would register at 7 o'clock on that Monday and join the webinar. And that worked extremely well. It's very beneficial in the sense that people are able to ask questions live directly to the presenters. They type questions in and we can answer them. It's very interactive, as you'll see later on. So it is a very good way to do it, but it's very stressful because you're constantly worried that something will go wrong, or the technology will let you down, or you'll say something that you shouldn't have said, etc. So it is quite stressful doing it that way. I'm glad we did run quite a few live because it really teaches you how to do them. But it doesn't mean you won't make mistakes, of course, in the future. What we did with our last IBS one that we recorded live, we kept that recording. So every single time you run a webinar, the webinar company will store your recording. So you end up building up a list of recordings, and you can choose any of those recordings to use what we call as on-demand webinars. So the last recording we did for IBS, we kept it as an on-demand webinar. So that is the one now that when people register, they get sent out that webinar. So they can watch it absolutely any time of the day or night. They don't have to come at a set day or at a set time. They can watch it whenever suits them best. You'll need to decide whether you want panelists and experts at your webinar as well. The first 6, 7 webinars we ran them just with myself and my colleague Kerry. She would do the IT side and the question side, and I would run the presentation, and that worked very well for what we needed for our first IBS advice webinar. However, there are lots of examples where actually to get experts in to join the webinar is extremely useful. So for instance, when we ran the celiac webinar recently, we had 2 gastroenterologists and a specialist dietitian as guest panelists. And that is fantastic because patients then are getting information from many different sources. So from the gastroenterologist, from the specialist dietitian, and from the experts that are in the room. So it's a really useful thing to do to have panelists there as well. So it totally depends on what type of webinar you're running and what you want to achieve. The main issue with panelists is that you really, to get a good feeling from that webinar and a cohesive and relaxed feeling from the webinar, if you've got other people involved, you really need to all be in the same room. So you need to hold it in one room, which means getting everybody together. So you need to be very organized about running that webinar. One person can set up the administration. That's not a problem. So if you have a keen member of your staff who is very happy to be involved in the webinars and is happy to run the administration side of setting up a webinar, then that's fantastic. You only need one person to set up the administration for a webinar. Obviously, if you've got a department and several areas of your department, specialities within your department are wanting to set up separate webinars, then it's best to have somebody from each of those separate departments who takes over the responsibility for setting up the administration for their particular webinar. I wouldn't give the administration of setting up a webinar to your secretarial admin staff because there are lots of questions in setting up a webinar that the HCP needs to answer, and what handouts they're going to use, what poll questions they're going to use. So it really is important that it's set up by an HCP, not by secretarial admin. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot of toing and froing, and it'd be very difficult for them to do. But that person who sets the webinar up really does need protected time. It's not rocket science, but it can be really confusing and quite complicated IT-wise at the very beginning. Once you've got the hang of it, it's not a problem. But setting up those webinars and getting the department going with webinars is really important, that somebody's given the time to find out how it works. They can then teach other members of the staff how to do it. but you really need protected time. I think you need a good 2 full days of a member of staff really getting on top of how everything works and functions. And that would include them setting up the specialist email account, in the sense, once the IT have given you the email address, you then need to be setting up standard emails that go out to patients that want to register. So setting up the actual webinar and setting up that dedicated email address, I would say a good couple of days of protected time. And after that, I think it's really important that if webinars are going to become a relevant part to your service, that you are given protected time, or give your staff protected time to continue to do other webinars. It's very tempting to think, well, now we've done one, really, quite frankly, it shouldn't take much time and people can just get on and do it in the evening. It's really not a problem. But actually, there's a lot of preparation that goes into it. So if you're watching this webinar now, and because your manager has asked you to set up a webinar, I would really strongly recommend that you ask your manager to watch this webinar as well, so that they can really get a handle on how much protected time you're going to need. To actually run the webinar on the night, you need a minimum of 2 people. You need one person who dedicates themselves to fielding the questions that are coming in and looking after the IT side, and one person who concentrates on the presentation. So assuming you haven't got any panelists in, the minimum number of people you will need is 2. Now that's because things inevitably always go wrong with technology and with webinars. Something will happen, the slides won't move forward, or a microphone will stop working, or there'll be some issue that happens with webinars. It's inevitable. So you need that person who's in charge of the IT to be very quietly just getting on with the IT problems that are occurring, if there are any, and also fielding the questions that are coming in from patients. If it's a live webinar, and if you're doing an on-demand webinar, organising the questions ready to ask you at the right time. So there's a lot that that second person needs to do. I would say running a webinar on your own is virtually impossible, particularly if it's going to have questions, etc. So definitely you need a minimum of 2 people to run a webinar. Agree a title for your webinar and make sure that that title says what it is on the tin. So with our IBS ones, our IBS webinar first line advice ones are basically, I've been diagnosed with IBS, what do I do now? That's the title. So it's really easy for the patient to see what sort of information they're going to get and whether it's appropriate for them to watch. Keep it very simple, not vague, just make sure it's clear to the patient what they're going to be watching. And then it's a case of creating your presentation. And a lot of what you create in your presentation will be based around the feedback you got from that SurveyMonkey information from patients. And it'll also obviously be based a lot on your knowledge and your expertise in your area, but you do want to do a nice mixture of what the information you know they're likely to want and what they really want to know as well. We tend to use PowerPoints. That's what people generally use for presentations these days. But if there are other formats, then that's absolutely fine, as long as it works with your webinar company. Keep the presentation relatively short. You could do bite-sized webinars of about 10 minutes if you wanted, or quarter of an hour. We generally say keep presentations to around 30 minutes maximum. And keep the slides very simple with lots of images. So you'll notice in this webinar, we've deliberately used just very simple images for most of the slides with very few words. Avoid the use of text and bullet points, lots of text and bullet points. Obviously, in some cases, text is absolutely imperative, but where you can, say it verbally to talk around your slide rather than trying to put all the information on the slide. Don't forget, with this webinar, you're going to be speaking, so they're going to hear you and you're going to talk around it, and they can re-watch that webinar and re-listen to you. So it's not important that it all goes on a slide. And in fact, for patients, I think it's really important that you don't bombard them with lots of text. The other really important aspect of running a webinar is the microphone you use. Now, it's totally possible to use an ordinary set of mobile phone headphones that have got a speaker on them. That's totally acceptable. The sound quality is okay, but it is not as good as if you used a standalone mic. And also, if you're having any panelists or anybody else taking part and often you're going to want to share the presentation with another person, then you don't want to be swapping and changing a set of headphones. It's cumbersome, it's difficult, it can break up the flow of the presentation, and quite frankly, a lot of people don't want to borrow your headphones anyway. So a microphone that's got a circular section to the top where it can basically take in volume or noise from all round the microphone is a really useful microphone to have. They cost between about £60 and £120. They're very sturdy. You really want to be looking on Google for something like a podcast mic. That's the sort of thing you're looking for, is something that's used for podcasts. It doesn't need to be hugely elaborate. It just needs to be strong with good audio, and one that basically will take in noise from all around, so that if you've got a group of you panelists all sitting around a table, the mic will pick up all the voices equally. So there's nothing worse than listening to a podcast or a webinar with bad audio, where it's crackly or you can't hear properly or you're missing bits, because quite frankly people just turn their screens off and give up. So really important, one of those things that you don't necessarily think about, and we've learnt along the way, and we bought a little, we've got a Samson, I think it's a Samson mic, and really basic, useful one, and I would really recommend it. Okay, so let's have a look at the next slide. If possible, have two people presenting the presentation. Now, I mentioned this earlier. The reason for this is that it makes the presentation sound more appealing, more flowing, and more interesting is the vital part, because your change of voice, the change of voices really keeps people awake and listening. So make sure you pre-arrange the division of the slides so everybody knows really clearly which slides they're going to be presenting before the webinar starts. And then make sure the mic is really close by, that you're all sitting around the desk ready, so you can basically just, you don't have to move the mic, you don't have to change anything. You can just, the other person can start presenting those set of slides. So we had, for instance, in our FODMAP webinar, we had 3 of us presenting different sections of the presentation, and it works really well because it just breaks up the monotony of one voice. And you'll know from listening to this today that it's just me presenting. It can get quite dull after a while listening to me. So I think it's really useful, if you can, to break up the presentation to at least 2 people. But they do need to be in the same room for it to work well. Okay, you can set up polls to check understanding in the webinars as well. And that is really, really useful, because if you've got quite a complex subject and you want to know whether people have really understood the way you've explained it and whether the message is getting through, after all, there's no point doing a webinar if you're not actually educating people. So you want to check along the way whether people are understanding. Then you can launch a poll. We can certainly do it in GoToWebinar. I'd say that was something you definitely want to have a facility for in whatever webinar company you choose. Really, really useful to do. And what I would say, how many polls would you have in a 30-minute presentation? I would set a maximum of 3 polls. The polls are fantastic, definitely use them, but they are quite cumbersome in the sense that you have to launch the poll, then you show everybody the results of the poll, then you might talk around the people that got the answer wrong. Obviously, you don't know who's answered what, so it's not a personal thing, it's very anonymous. But if you can see that some people are getting the answer wrong, it gives you the perfect opportunity to talk around that and explain why that was the wrong answer, so you can try and really emphasize the educational side of it. So I think the polls are brilliant, but you then have to stop the poll, restart the presentation, and that can be quite cumbersome. So I wouldn't say you want to do more than 3 polls in a 30-minute presentation, but definitely worth doing. So actually I'm going to launch a poll now, just to show you how they work, and launch poll. So here we go. What is the minimum number of people you would need in order to run a webinar? Select one of the following. So you would select any of those polls. Now, we haven't got anybody here, because I'm doing this on my own, to actually choose any of those. But what would normally come up is you get people answering. Obviously, what's the minimum number of people you need in order to run a webinar? The answer is 2. And then you can see very clearly who's got the answer right and who's got the answer wrong, and you can talk around that and make sure that they understand. Polls. Will polls be available with an on-demand webinar? So I talked earlier about the fact that you've got live webinars and you've got on-demand webinars. On demand, they can watch any time of day or night, whenever suits them best. Yes, they will still be able to take part in the polls, which sounds strange because there's nobody at the other end of the screen controlling those polls. They can vote and they can watch the poll being launched and the results. What's actually happening in reality is that it's the original poll from that original recording that they're seeing, but they've been able to actually press a button and make it look as though they're taking part in the poll. So it's a bit of a deception game, but they feel that they're taking part in that poll and answering as well. So yes, they can take part in on-demand polls, in on-demand webinars as well. You can have 5 downloadable information sheets attached to a webinar. We upload these as PDFs. Now, each PDF could be quite big in its own right, so you could have a booklet or a copy of the presentation, etc. So 5 downloadable information sheets is fantastic because it saves you having to send out documentation to patients, printing information off the page. It saves a lot of administration costs. The other thing that we put on some of our webinars is self-referral forms as well. So patients who watch, for instance, our IBS webinar and feel that they've done everything that we suggested, but they still are not right, will have downloaded a self-referral form when they watch the webinar. They can now fill that in and send it back and come in for a one-to-one appointment. Now, the concern that people had originally was that we were going to be overrun with appointments, people sending in these self-referral forms. Well, we've actually had 16 self-referral forms returned in the last 18 months, which is hardly anything. And it just shows that if the webinars are successful, then people don't feel the need necessarily to fill in the self-referral form. Our webinars, we get 96% of people saying that they will recommend them to friends, and over 80% saying it improved their knowledge about their condition. So I think the truth is that if the webinar is giving them everything they need, you've researched it well, and you've put a good presentation together, you've had good questions around the webinar as well that people can hear, then I think you'll have solved a lot of problems for a lot of the people, and that's why we just don't get very many self-referral forms in. Allow 20 minutes for questions and answers. So you run, let's say, your 30-minute webinar presentation, and then after that you might run 20 minutes of questions and answers. And that's really important to give people an opportunity to ask questions they don't feel have been answered during the presentation. But if you're pre-recording, in other words, what I'm doing today is I'm recording this, I'm not doing it to a live audience, which is why we had nobody on the polls, and we're pre-recording it, and therefore what you would do in those instances is, I think I mentioned briefly earlier, is you would put together a list of frequently asked questions and make those sound as if you are doing them live. So it sounds to the person listening to on demand as if that question's just coming live from a person, and you're asking it and giving the answer there and then. And by doing a list of frequently asked questions, you're going to cover most of the topics that were likely to have come up if you'd done that webinar live. What we did with our first 7 to 8 webinars that we ran live for IBS is that we logged all the questions that we got. In fact, the questions are recorded for you by the webinar company, so you can see what questions came in with each webinar. And we collated all those together and put a list of frequently asked questions based on those 7 or 8 webinars. And in the last webinar that we recorded live, we made sure that we asked all those questions along with any new ones that came in at that particular webinar. So there were there's quite a lot of question and answer sessions. It's also a very useful stage for the patient because they're not having to really concentrate on the presentation anymore. They can just relax and listen to the question and answers coming in. And that's often it feels like a very interactive side to the webinar, even though they're just listening to it. I would always dedicate one person in your team. So the person doing the IT, for instance, might be the person that is asking the questions, and the person doing the presentation might be the person that answers the questions. So it depends if you've got panelists here, of course. If you've got panelists, then you'd organise it slightly differently. You'd pre-allocate which of your team will answer which questions. So if you've got panelists here, you would already have organised the questions that are going to come up and who is going to answer those questions. Now that's because if you ask a question without preparation, as we've learnt the hard way, and nobody's quite sure who should answer it, you get this bit of time lag between people saying, oh, yeah, and then two people start answering at the same time, and it all just sounds very staccato. So if you've pre-organised it, it means it's very smooth and very easy on the ear for the attendees. You're asking a question, somebody automatically answers with an excellent response, and it just all moves very smoothly on. You can decide if you want patients asking questions or not. So this facility can be turned off or on for live or on-demand webinars. So in a live webinar, you don't have to give the facility to ask questions. And an on-demand webinar, they can still ask questions, even though you're obviously not at the end of the screen waiting to answer them. And what will happen is when they ask the question, a little pop-up box will come saying, thank you for your question will be answered in the next, and you could put 24 hours, 48 hours, 7 days, whatever suits you. Remember that if you have that facility, you need to allocate somebody to be responsible for making sure they go into your dedicated email address and checking for any questions, because the webinar company will forward any of those questions straight to your dedicated email address. So you do need somebody to check the questions and answer them. So in some instances, having a facility for questions is very useful. It's certainly very interactive for the patients, but it's not always practical from an administrative point of view. So have a really good think about whether you want to offer that or not. Collecting pre and post webinar data. This is so important. It doesn't matter if you're a physio department, OT, speech and language, dietetics, consultants, it doesn't matter where you are, you need to prove that your webinars are actually educating people and working. So we have a survey that goes out before the webinar and a survey after the webinar, and it's really important that you do collect that data. The GoToWebinar company do supply an automatic survey, which is launched when the person turns off the webinar. The only trouble with that is that with GoToWebinar, you can watch the webinar on demand, you can watch it as if it's live, but in that form it can't be fast forwarded or rewound or paused. But to do that, you close the webinar down, and the webinar company will send you a copy of the actual recording. That copy you can pause and rewind with whenever you want. But of course, your survey that they launched came out when you closed the original copy down, and you may not have even finished watching the webinar. So the survey is pretty irrelevant at that stage. If you're doing really short little webinars of 10 minutes, then the chances are that the patient will have watched that whole 10 minutes, and therefore if a survey pops up, it probably is going to give you some useful data. But I would generally say that you want to avoid the automatic surveys. The other problems with the automatic surveys is they're very limited. You're not going to get useful things like Likert scales. You can't really get nitty-gritty data that you could write up later on from a webinar company. It can be really difficult to ensure the data is accurate. So I would suggest that you instead use something like a data collection tool like SurveyMonkey or Questback. We used SurveyMonkey for our first 6 or 7 webinars. Absolutely brilliant, really easy to use. The data isn't as gritty as you get from Questback, but very good data, and the simplicity of the use is fantastic. The only problem with SurveyMonkey is you only get the first 100 responses free in the free service. After that, it costs £35 a month, and that obviously is expensive for a department. Questback, we moved over to Questback because Somerset Partnership already had Questback as part of their patient interaction, and so we've been able to use that. It's a much more complex service. You need to get somebody dedicated to setting up those Questback surveys for you in your department. This is an area that your administration secretarial staff could do, and I think would do extremely well if you've got admin staff that can help you. But QuestBack is a little bit more complicated, does give you more gritty data, but you really got to see what it is you need from your data, but definitely collect data. Then I would say you really need to look at setting a date for your practice session. The practice session is so important because particularly in the early days, you're going to start a webinar, something is bound to go wrong. You need to sort out who's going to say what in the presentation, who's going to answer the questions. Everybody needs to make sure they're using the tech well. There are so many things that can go wrong, and you really need to have a practice session. So you need to set an evening aside or an afternoon or a morning aside where you can run a practice session. That is really, really important. And then you'd set a date for the live recording where you all come together for the live recording as well. If you've got panelists coming, I wouldn't say they necessarily need to come to the practice session, but you running the webinar needs to know exactly what's going to happen on that live recording session with the panelists. So you need to have sorted out what questions they're going to get, make sure they've had a list of those questions in advance so that they can look up answers appropriately, let them know the basics of how the evening or the day is going to run when you're recording it. So make sure they're as prepared as they can be, but you don't necessarily need to get them to come along to the practice session. That really is for your team to make sure that you're going to be running the webinar well. If you're not having panelists, obviously it's much easier. You just get together for your practice, then you get together for your live recording, and off you go. You will make mistakes. Today I have already recorded this webinar and I forgot to launch the presentation. So I listened back afterwards, feeling very pleased with myself, only to realise there were no slides at all. There was just my voice. So it is, you know, frustrating that there are several things to think about and you can so easily make a mistake. I started recording with my mic switched off before and had to edit that out. And we've had issues where the slides just suddenly, for no apparent reason, stopped moving. And we've had to spend time sorting that out. We had one webinar where there was 2 minutes of nothingness happening because we were trying to sort out some IT error. Well, don't worry about that. Don't restart the webinar just because that's happened. And this is really important because it's very tempting to go, oh, that was a disaster, quick, close it down, let's start again. Don't do that because you can always edit the webinar afterwards. Editing a webinar is relatively easy. You just download it and you use something like a free tool like iMovie, which it comes free on iPads and Macs. It's also on iPhones, but obviously the screen generally is a bit small. Some of the new iPhones might be okay, but a bit fiddly to work with on an iPhone. But an iPad, iMovie comes free. It's very, very easy to use. You literally would just play the recording and then cut the piece out that you need to cut out. And then stick the two ends together. It really is easy to edit your webinar. After editing, and you re-upload that webinar back onto your webinar service, when you use that edited recording, you can still download handouts, you can still ask questions if you've decided to have that facility switched on. The only difference is the polls. After you've edited a webinar, the polls, you can no longer take part in the polls. You can see the polls that were launched and the answers and hear everything that was said around those polls, and when you were discussing how people got some of the wrong answers and this why the answer was wrong, etc., and really educating people, they can hear all of that. They can see everything to do with the poll. So it really doesn't matter that much. It's just that they're not physically clicking any buttons to feel like taking part in the poll. Send your webinar out for review. Well, this is a really difficult one because my feeling is that the only way you're really going to get a review is by getting it out there with the patients. You can send it to charities, for instance, like your local celiac group, if it's a celiac webinar, or people you know, or HCPs to get their feedback. But really what you want is to get it out there, being used with patients, and get their feedback from the surveys you've launched. So you will be fed all sorts of information back in those surveys, because we always say, you know, what could we have improved? What could we have done better? What would you have liked to know more about? And it's amazing the information that comes back. And with all tools that you have, so if you had a written handout that you gave to patients, you would normally set a review date for that. So in a year's time, you'd say this document needs to be reviewed. Well, It's no different for the webinars. I would say every 6 months to 12 months, you need to be reviewing that webinar. And then you use the information that's come back through the surveys to look at how you might change it. And the good thing about rerunning the webinar in 6 to 12 months is the fact you can bring in new data and new information that's now out there that perhaps wasn't available at the time you first recorded it. So it is really important to get it reviewed, but actually I would just get it out there being used, and that will be your review. Marketing is everything. Really, really important. And we're not marketeers, we're healthcare professionals. So it doesn't necessarily come naturally to us, but it is so important. You could have the best webinar in the world, but no one will know about it unless they can actually hear about it, unless you tell them about it. So things like using Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, anybody in your department giving a talk, even if it's nothing to do with the webinars, should have a webinar slide on there, just letting the audience know that we now do run webinars and that these are the subjects that we cover. Letters that go out from the department. So, for instance, every IBS patient that's referred by a GP to us or anybody will receive paperwork. One of the sheets they get is a poster about the webinars, giving them all the information about why webinars are useful, and then they also get a letter, and on that gives them more information about the webinars and why they might find it helpful to attend a webinar. Particularly when you're looking at the fact that they don't need to travel, they don't need to find parking, they don't need to take time off work, they don't need to find care for their children or for elderly relatives, etc., or for sick partners. So you can just sit at home on the sofa and listen to the webinar whenever you want. If you need to put the children to bed suddenly in the middle of it, you can stop it and go and put the children to bed. So it's a very easy to use facility, but you need to get that message out there. You need to market them. And I would say that what you really need to do is get a good email list of all relevant healthcare professionals. So for instance, we've put an email list for Somerset together of all the senior GPs, all the practice managers, and all the pharmacies. For our paediatric webinars, we've just put together a list of all the health visitors and school nurses. So really, and there'll be lots of other groups that you could use depending on what your webinar is about and who it's aimed at. But the marketing never stops. Don't feel that just because you've told the lead in speech therapy about the webinars that all the speech therapists will necessarily know. They won't. If necessary, go and give a talk to their department and tell them, but equally email them all, get an email list for that department and email them regularly. We send monthly reminders to all the GPs, the pharmacies and the practice managers, and it's incredible how slowly but surely you will find that you will build up people coming on board. And we're slowly getting, even 18 months down the line, I had an email this week from a GP practice saying, oh, do you mind if we put this on our website and your dedicated email address? And we said, no, absolutely, please go ahead. So, you know, more and more GP practices are actually really promoting it on their websites, in their waiting rooms, and pharmacies are now promoting it, but it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. But if you keep marketing, it will get better. Your stats will go up and your numbers attending will leap up like a rocket. So just keep on marketing. The more people know, then the more word will spread. So it's sort of like a snowball effect. It starts off slowly, and we were having about 3 patients contact the dedicated email address a week. To begin with, we're now getting about 4 patients a day saying they've been told to come and attend the webinar for IBS. So it really does ramp up. So what I would say is just try it, give it a try. Don't be scared of setting up a webinar. It will take time initially to get your head around the technology of the particular web company that you use, webinar company, but you persevere and it will work, and you will find it incredibly beneficial. One of the episodes that we've done on the first episode is, you know, why would you run a webinar for patients? And on that, we've got a slide of how much using the webinars has brought down our referral rates in our one-to-one service. So our one-to-one gastro service has the referral rates for one-to-ones has dropped by nearly 50% since we started the webinars. Now that has meant that as a service we can now take on inflammatory bowel disease and remission and celiac disease, which would have been unthinkable before. We just would not have had time. So the webinars have really reduced our one-to-one rates, and I would highly recommend them. So fundamentally, just do it. Just go and do the webinars. See how they work. Don't worry about the mistakes you make. Edit the mistakes out or redo the webinar if you really feel that it wasn't good enough. But whichever way, just crack on and do it. And I wish you all luck, and do let us know how it goes. We will really love to know what other data groups are collecting and what other disciplines, whether it's physio or OT or consultants or GPs or whoever it is. We would love to get feedback on how your webinars are going. And I hope that this has been useful. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.